Welcome to this video lecture on trends in Shakespearean studies. The earlier critics of Shakespeare. The first one is Robert Greene, and he is a university wit, and he passed a comment on Shakespeare that an abstract crow beautified with our feathers. And following that, Hemming and Cornell, and he is a friend of Shakespeare's, and he brought out that the first folio of Shakespeare, and the contemporary of Shakespeare, that is Ben Jonson, and he criticized Shakespeare as small Latin and less Greek. The neoclassical poet Restoration period, the poet and critic Dryden's assessment of Shakespeare. Dryden remarks that Shakespeare was the man who of all modern and perhaps ancient poets had the largest and most comprehensive soul. So, answering to the critics who criticize Shakespeare, saying that he lacked learning, right? Maybe like Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, who made the comment that he knows less Greek and small Latin and less Greek. Dryden says the poet was naturally learned. All the images of nature were still present to him, and he drew them, not laboriously, but luckily. When he describes anything, you more than see it, you feel it too. Dryden felt that Shakespeare lived in a barbarous age and failed to control his fancy and keep it within the bounds of reason and judgment. He regarded Shakespeare as a rough diamond which must be first polished before it shines. Dryden also acknowledges Shakespeare's contributions to the English language. He says it's almost a miracle that much of his language remains so pure. Dryden criticized Shakespeare's indeed actually. At the same time, he found in Shakespeare elements of enduring value. Dryden's love for Shakespeare cannot be better expressed but in the words of his. Shakespeare was Homer or father of our dramatic poets. Jonson was the Virgil, the pattern of elaborate writing. I admire him, but I love Shakespeare. Dr. Johnson, the another giant figure from the English literatures, and he talks about the merits and defects of Shakespeare in his preface to the plays of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's greatness lies in the fact that he is the poet of natures. Johnson says Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature. The poet holds up the reader a faithful mirror of human nature. Johnson further comments on Shakespeare's characterization. He says Shakespeare has no heroes. His scenes are occupied only by men who act and speak as the reader thinks that he should himself have spoken or acted on the same occasion. On the contrary, other dramatists portray their characters in such a hyperbolic or exaggerated way that the reader cannot suit them to their life. Johnson defends Shakespeare for his mingling of the tragic and comic elements in his plays on grounds of realism. Johnson regards Shakespeare's mingling of tragedy and comedy as a merit because he cannot recollect among the Greeks or Romans as a single writer who attempted both. Shakespeare always makes nature predominance over accident. His story requires Roman, but he thinks only on men. This is the prize Johnson's made on Shakespeare. In his preface to Shakespeare, Dr. Samuel Johnson brings out the excellence first, then he turns to his demerits also. So, according to Johnson's, these are the defects of Shakespeare. The first one is Shakespeare's sacrifices the virtue to convenience and is so much more careful to please than to instruct that he seems to write without any moral purpose. Moreover, he lacks poetic justice. He makes no just distributions of good or evil. Shakespeare's plot constructions has also fault. According to Johnson, the plots are often loosely formed and carelessly pursued. He omits opportunities of instructing or delighting which the development of the plot provides to him. Moreover, in many of his plays, the later part is evidently neglected. Johnson's another charge against Shakespeare is regarding distinctions, time and place. He attributed to a certain nations or a certain period of history the customs, the practices and opinions of another. For example, we find Hector quoting Aristotle in Troilus and Cressidia. However, Johnson regards that it's not a fault of Shakespeare to violate laws of unities established by the joint authority of the poets and critics. Rather, this violation proves the comprehensive genius of Shakespeare. Actually, a drama indicates successive actions. Therefore, just as they may be represented at successive places, so also they may be represented at different periods separated by several years. And so, Shakespeare violates that unity of time and place. However, Shakespeare observes unity of action. Shakespeare's another fault in the eye of Johnson is his over fondness for quibbles. A quibble was to him the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world and was content to lose it. But to say Johnson here sacrificed his strong common sense for the sake of an eloquent metaphor. Shakespeare's comic dialects is often coarse according to Johnson. The gentlemen and the ladies in comic scenes show little delicacy or refinement and are hardly to be distinguished from the clowns. His tragic plays become worse in proportions to the labor he spends on them. His narrations shows an undue pomp of dictions and unnecessary verbiage and repetitions. His declamations of set of speeches are generally cold and feeble. Shakespeare prized by romantic critics. The English romantic critic William Hazlitt and S.T. Coleridge prized over Shakespeare. Hazlitt drew attention to the gem-like poetic passages in Shakespeare. Coleridge was the first to discuss the unplumbed mystery of Hamlet's delay and motiveless malignity of Iago. Dowden's contributions to Shakespearean studies. Dowden is a professor in the University of Dublin and also vice president of New Shakespearean Society. And he is the first critic to the growth and development of Shakespeare's mind and art. His contributions to the study and place of Shakespeare in the chronological order. He divided Shakespeare's writing career into 4 phases. The first phase is in the workshop, he named it. The second one is Shakespeare in that world, and third one is Shakespeare out of depth, and fourth one Shakespeare on the height. So Dowden did 2 books on Shakespeare, that is Shakespeare, a critical study of his mind and art, and the second one is a Shakespeare premiere. Wilson Knight's contribution to Shakespearean criticism. G. Wilson Knight, the originator of the new approach to Shakespeare. He calls his own criticisms interpretations only. On the principles of Shakespeare's interpretations, a seminal work in the field of Shakespeare criticism, he argues that a true understanding of Shakespeare's plays requires an exploration of their profound psychological and moral depth, which he refers to the spiritual symbolism. Knight proposes that Shakespeare's plays are merely a collection of characters and events, but rather a tapestry of symbols and archetypal elements. Wilson Knight's Mutual Flame, The Wheel of Fire are his best critical studies of Shakespeare. A.C. Bradley. Bradley is the first British critic of Shakespeare of the 20th century. His seminal work Shakespearean Tragedy is regarded as a classical piece of criticisms on the bard. Although at the first work was considered reputable and was reprinted multiple times, his approach became flawed in the eyes of the scholars of the early 1920s. This is because Bradley imagined Shakespeare's characters as real people, and most of scholars did not agree with this. The detachment from Bradley's works is felt even more in the second half of the 20th century, but still some scholars pay tribute to the greatness of the classical approach of Bradley and the view of character as a historical category of evolution. Thank you.